The days that followed were different, in ways Leonard hadn't expected. He woke up each morning in the shelter, sunlight peeking through the dusty blinds. His body still aching from years on the street, but his mind clearer than it had been in ages. The simple things felt monumental. Brushing his teeth in front of a cracked mirror, pulling on a clean shirt from the donation closet, sitting with a caseworker who remembered his name. Each small task was another brick laid in the rebuilding of his life, though the old instincts never left completely. He still flinched when strangers approached too fast, still eyed an open doorway with suspicion. Trust didn't return all at once. But hope had made a home inside him, and thou visited again. Then again. The two brothers took slow steps toward mending what had been fractured for years. They shared meals in the common room, laughing awkwardly about old times and fumbling their way through apologies that had waited too long. Leonard learned that Paul had a family now, 2 kids and a wife who had pressed him to look for his brother after the video surfaced. There were no grand reconciliations, just a quiet agreement that neither of them wanted to let things stay broken anymore. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of Barron's gesture didn't fade. Donations flooded into Hope Outreach, more than they had ever seen. Staff added beds to their shelter, opened new job training programs, and even started a scholarship fund. Leonard watched the changes unfold around him, sometimes still in disbelief that he had been the spark for all of it. His face appeared in local news stories, his name mentioned in articles about homelessness and second chances, but the attention never felt like it belonged to him. In his mind, he was just a man who'd happened to be sitting on the right street corner when a teenager with white sneakers and a clear gaze decided to stop. One crisp morning, Leonard found himself standing in front of the old plant where he used to work, the windows boarded up, graffiti covering the brick walls. He hadn't come here to mourn what was lost, but to acknowledge it. The man he had been when he worked inside that building wasn't the same man he was now. That man had been proud to the point of isolation, convinced he had to handle everything alone. Now, Leonard knew better. He made his way back to Hope Outreach, where he met with his caseworker, a kind woman named Ms. Reynolds who always wore bright scarves. She handed him a paper with a smile that seemed to stretch from her eyes to her heart. "You've got an interview tomorrow," she said. "Warehouse position, steady hours. Decent pay, I think you're ready." Leonard stared at the paper in his hands, his fingers trembling slightly. It wasn't his old job, but it was a start. "Thanks," he managed to say, his voice thick. The night before his interview, Leonard barely slept. He lay awake in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through worries and possibilities. Would they see the old Leonard, the one who'd lived on the streets, or the new one, trying to piece his life back together? Morning came with a bite of cold air that snuck in through the shelter's windows, and he dressed carefully in the best clothes he had. Ms. Reynolds had pressed his shirt herself, and the volunteers at the center had polished the shoes he wore. He looked at himself in the mirror, not quite recognizing the man who stared back, but liking him anyway. The interview was harder than he expected. The manager was polite but cautious, asking questions that probed into the gaps in his work history. Leonard answered as honestly as he could, keeping his hands steady and his voice level. When they shook hands at the end, he left unsure of how it had gone. But later that afternoon, Ms. Reynolds handed him a letter. Hired. He exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and felt something lift off his shoulders. That evening, he sat on the front steps of Hope Outreach, watching the sun sink low over Cleveland. His brother sat beside him, a coffee cup warming his hands. They didn't say much. They didn't have to. Leonard's mind drifted to Barron. He wondered what the boy was doing, if he knew the kind of difference his simple gesture had made. He wondered if Barron had any idea that his challenge, "Help yourself tomorrow," was something Leonard carried with him every single day. Word eventually got back to Barron, through the staff at Hope Outreach, that Leonard had gotten a job. Barron didn't make any grand announcements or social media posts. He just smiled quietly to himself and went on with his day, knowing that the world was a little different because he had decided to listen. Months passed. Leonard saved every penny he could from his paychecks, scraping together enough for a room of his own in a small apartment building. It wasn't much, but it was his. He found an old radio at a thrift store and played music as he cooked simple meals on a hot plate. Sometimes Paul and his family came over, bringing home cooked dinners that filled the space with the kind of warmth Leonard had almost forgotten. Sometimes he just sat by the window with a book, content in the quiet. The media eventually moved on to other stories, and people stopped whispering about the viral video. But the kindness didn't fade. At the shelter, new faces arrived every week, some of them carrying the same look Leonard had when he first walked through the doors. Lost, exhausted, skeptical, and he became someone they looked to. He shared his story when it felt right, never forcing it, just offering it up like a thread they could follow. One chilly evening in early spring, Leonard stood behind a folding table at a community event organized by Hope Outreach. He was handing out sandwiches and bottled water to anyone who needed it. Across the street, a teenager in scuffed shoes and a threadbare hoodie hesitated near the curb. Leonard caught his eye and gave him a small nod. The boy stepped forward, and Leonard handed him a sandwich. Their hands touched briefly and Leonard smiled. "What's your name?" Leonard asked. The boy blinked, surprised anyone wanted to know. He said quietly, "Good to meet you, Tyler," Leonard replied. "Come inside. Get warm." And just like that, the cycle began again. A simple act of kindness. A moment of seeing someone who thought they were invisible. Late that night, as Leonard locked up and walked toward the bus stop, he realized something. The dollar he'd asked for on that cold winter day had been the smallest part of the story. What had changed his life wasn't the money, but the belief that someone cared, that someone saw him as more than a statistic, more than a man on the street corner with a cardboard sign. Barron's challenge had been simple. Help yourself tomorrow, and Leonard had. And now he was helping others to do the same. Spring unfolded slowly, as it often does in Cleveland. The wind still carried a bite, but there were moments in the late afternoons when the sun lingered long enough to warm the skin. Leonard walked to work each morning with a steady rhythm in his step, his hands tucked deep into the pockets of his jacket, a sense of purpose guiding him through streets that had once felt so cold and indifferent. The warehouse job wasn't glamorous. It was hard work, lifting and sorting shipments, loading trucks, sweeping floors. But it was honest. Every paycheck felt like something he had earned, something that wasn't slipping through his fingers. At night, Leonard returned to his small apartment, where the second-hand lamp on the kitchen table gave off a warm glow, and the scuffed floors squeaked under his boots. He found peace in the quiet. Some evenings, Paul stopped by with his kids, their laughter filling the space and shaking loose some of the shadows that still clung to him. It was strange, this new life he was building. Fragile but steady, word of Leonard's turnaround spread beyond the walls of Hope Outreach. Other shelters invited him to speak, not because he was eloquent, but because his story wasn't polished or sanitized. He told the truth about the nights he'd spent curled up on concrete, the ache of hunger gnawing through his gut, the shame that came from being invisible to a world that kept moving without him. But he also spoke about the day Barron Trump stopped, listened, and handed him more than just money. He talked about the promise he made that day, a promise that carried him through sleepless nights in the bone, deep exhaustion of climbing back into the world. People listened. Some cried. Some walked up afterward to shake his hand, pressing folded bills into his palm that he always passed along to Hope Outreach. He didn't want their money. He wanted them to see others, to notice, to stop, just like Barron had. Leonard didn't hear much from Barron in those months. There were no calls, no letters, no appearances, and that was fine. He didn't need to be a part of Barron's world. But every so often, he wondered about the teenager who had knelt beside him on the sidewalk and changed everything with a quiet conversation and a note scrawled on a piece of paper. One rainy afternoon, as Leonard was finishing his shift at the warehouse, his supervisor called him into the office. The man was big, his knuckles scarred from years of hard labor, but his expression was kind. He slid an envelope across the desk. "You've got visitors," he said. "Fancy ones." Leonard frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. He wiped his hands on his work pants and stepped outside. There, standing beneath a black umbrella, was Barron, older now, sharp around the edges, but the same steady eyes. Leonard froze for a beat, then took a few steps closer. "Didn't expect to see you here." Barron gave a faint smile, closing the umbrella and shaking off the water. Figured it was time I checked in. How Leonard chuckled. I'm still breathing, still working. He motioned toward the warehouse. Keeps me out of trouble. Barron nodded, his gaze sweeping the street. You look good. They stood there for a long moment in the drizzle, saying nothing. Then Barron reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it over. Leonard opened it, frowning at the name of a company at the top. What's this? He asked. A job offer, Barron said. A better one? Leonard shook his head. I've got a job. I know, Barron replied. But this one's different. Community Outreach Director. You'd be helping people like you once were. Building programs. Creating opportunities. Leonard's heart thudded. I don't have a degree. You don't need one, Barron said. You've lived it. That's what matters. Leonard ran a hand over his jaw, his fingers rough with calluses. Why me? Barron's expression softened. Because you didn't give up, and because you're already doing the work. Might as well get paid for it, bot. The offer hung between them like something fragile. Leonard wasn't sure if he was ready to leave the warehouse, leave the familiarity of labor and sweat and quiet evenings. But the idea of helping others, of doing what Barron had done for him, felt right. You don't give up on people, do you? Leonard asked, folding the paper carefully. Barron shrugged. I guess not. Leonard chuckled softly. That makes two of us. The next weeks were a blur. Leonard submitted his notice at the warehouse, packed up his apartment, and moved into a small house near the outreach center where he would be working. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his. He painted the walls himself, hung photos of his family on the living room wall, and bought a battered old armchair from the thrift store, where he now spent his weekends searching for books. He threw himself into his new job with a focus he hadn't known he had. He built programs for job training, worked with local businesses to secure interviews for people just like him, and helped create a community garden that gave the neighborhood a space to grow their own food. He spent late nights at the center, filling out grant applications and strategizing new ways to expand the services they offered. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Leonard sat on the steps outside the center, watching the street lamps flicker on. Barron pulled up in a sleek black car and joined him, sitting with his elbows on his knees. You've done a lot in a short time, Barron said. Leonard shrugged. Didn't want to waste it, bot. You haven't, Barron replied. They sat there in the quiet for a while, watching kids ride their bikes up and down the block. Eventually, Leonard spoke. You ever think about that day, when you stopped on the street? Barron nodded. Sometimes. I didn't know what would happen. Neither did I, Leonard said. But it mattered. More than you probably realized. Barron's eyes drifted to the street, thoughtful. I think we all need someone to believe in us. Even when we don't believe in ourselves. Leonard nodded. That's the truth. Over time, Leonard's story became part of a larger movement. Other cities launched similar programs. Outreach centers sprouted up in places that had once ignored the homeless. And though Barron's name often appeared in headlines, it was Leonard's face people recognized. Gritty, unpolished, and real. He didn't become rich. He didn't want to. He measured his success in the people who came through his door, their shoulders hunched with defeat, but leaving with a spark in their eyes. He measured it in the laughter of children in the community garden, in the handshakes of men and women who found jobs, homes, and purpose again. Years later, as he sat in his office overlooking the street, where it all began, Leonard thought about how close he'd come to disappearing, and how a teenager with a quiet voice and white sneakers had saved him. When a knock sounded at his door, Leonard turned to see a young man standing there, nervous and thin, holding a crumpled resume in his hand. Can I help you? Leonard asked. The man cleared his throat. I'm looking for work. Someone said this is where to start. Leonard smiled, standing up and crossing the room to shake his hand. You've come to the right place. Leonard's days became a steady rhythm of early mornings and late nights, but they were full in a way he had never experienced before. He wasn't just working a job, he was living a purpose. Every time someone new walked through the doors of the outreach center, shoulders heavy, eyes wary, Leonard saw a reflection of himself not too long ago. And each time he extended a hand or offered a quiet word of encouragement, He felt a weight lift, not just for them, but for himself. The walls of the center were no longer bare. Photographs hung there now, faces smiling at job fairs, families gathered at community picnics, kids playing in the garden they had built from scratch. And in the corner of his office, Leonard kept something small but important. The piece of paper Barron had given him with the address of Hope Outreach scribbled on it. It was worn, the edges frayed, but it reminded him every day where this all began. One evening, long after most of the staff had gone home, Leonard found himself sitting at his desk, reviewing the latest plans for an after-school program. The building was quiet, the hum of the heater the only sound breaking the silence. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment, thinking of how far things had come. The man he used to be, the one who sat on the cold sidewalk, clutching a cardboard sign, felt like a distant memory, but he never let himself forget. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. When he stood and opened it, Barron was there, casually dressed. His usual sharp suit traded for jeans and a sweater. They didn't say much at first. They didn't need to. Barron stepped inside and sat in the chair opposite Leonard's desk, looking around the office. "You've made this place your own," Barron said finally, his voice low. Leonard smiled faintly. "It's not just mine. It belongs to a lot of people now." Barron nodded, running his hand along the edge of the desk. "I've been thinking about expanding the program. What you've done here, it could be done in other cities." Leonard raised an eyebrow. "That's a big idea." Barron's lips twitched in amusement. "Big ideas are kind of my thing." Leonard chuckled at that. He had come to respect Barron not just for his influence, but for his persistence. He didn't give up, and neither did Leonard. They had that in common. "I'm in," Leonard said after a pause. "But if we do this, we do it right. Not some publicity stunt." Barron's gaze met his. "You think I'm here for a photo op?" Leonard shook his head slowly. "No. I think you understand what's at stake." Barron leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Then, let's build something that lasts." And that was how it began. Over the following months, Leonard and Barron worked side by side, visiting other cities, meeting with leaders of shelters and community centers, listening to the people who were often overlooked. Leonard was the bridge. Someone who understood the streets, who had lived the life so many were still living. Barron brought the resources and influence to open doors that had long been closed. It wasn't easy. Not everyone welcomed them. Some thought it was just a vanity project for a rich kid trying to repair his family's image. But Leonard was quick to silence the critics. He stood in front of crowds and told his truth, how he had nothing and was given a second chance by someone who didn't owe him a thing, and how that simple act had become something larger, something that gave hope to more people than he could have ever imagined. Years passed. Programs expanded across the country. The outreach centers flourished, and Leonard found himself traveling more than he ever thought he would. But no matter where he went, he always came home to Cleveland. It was where his story started, and it was where his heart remained. On one bright spring morning, Leonard stood in front of a crowd gathered for the opening of a new community center. Barron stood beside him, clapping as Leonard took the podium. He looked out at the sea of faces, young and old, tired and hopeful, and cleared his throat. "I'm not a politician," Leonard began. "I'm not a preacher or a businessman. I'm just a man who was given a second chance, and I'm here to tell you that you deserve one, too." The crowd was silent, listening intently. "Years ago, I was sitting on a sidewalk with nothing but a cardboard sign and an empty stomach. I thought I was invisible, that no one saw me, but someone did, and that one moment, just one person taking the time to stop, changed everything." He paused, scanning the crowd. "That's why we're here today, not because of me, not because of one person, but because when one person reaches out, others do too. And that's how change happens." There was a hush and then applause. Leonard stepped back from the microphone, his heart pounding, but his smile easy and real. Barron clapped him on the back, pride flashing in his expression. Later that day, as they sat beneath a tree outside the center, Barron turned to Leonard. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been if I hadn't stopped that day?" Leonard nodded slowly. "All the time." Barron tilted his head. "What made you ask me for help? Why me?" Leonard smiled faintly. watching a group of kids chasing each other in the park. Because you stopped. You weren't in a rush. You weren't pretending I wasn't there. You saw me. And I figured why not? Barron chuckled. You figured right. They sat in silence after that, watching the world go by in a place they had helped heal. Leonard knew there would always be more work to do, more people to help, more lives to change. But he also knew they had built something lasting, something that would outlive them both. On his office wall, Leonard had added a new photo. It was simple, shot of him and Barron sitting on the sidewalk where they first met. Someone had taken it without them knowing. Two people from very different worlds, sitting eye to eye. He kept that picture as a reminder of who he had been, of who he had become, and of the truth that had carried him through everything. That one small moment of kindness can change a life. Sometimes it can change the world. And for Leonard, it had.